All right. Welcome to everyone to day 3 of our summer seminar. It's great to be with all of you again. It's a special pleasure for me to be moderating this session with two very good friends, Pete Colosi and Michael Miller. They'll be addressing the theme of the session, the embodied person. We'll hear first from Pete and then we'll hear from Mike. Just a brief word of introduction. All of you, of course, have access to the bios on the website, but Pete, who will be speaking first, is an associate professor of philosophy at Salve Regina University in Rhode Island. He did his undergrad in math at Franciscan University of Steubenville. His PhD was from the International Academy of Philosophy in Liechtenstein, which was in that time really the center for Hildebrand and personalist studies in the world. He's published in areas of medical ethics, Catholic social teaching, and Franciscan studies. He's the founder of the Theology of the Body International Symposia, which I recommend to all of you. The website contains the videos of presentations from those conferences, which happen every other year. And there's a wonderful resource for those of you interested in theology of the body. Last but not least, Pete is an associated scholar of the Hildebrand Project, which we're very, very happy about. A brief word of introduction for Michael, since we're going to go straight from one talk to the other. Michael is research fellow and director of Acton Media at the Acton Institute. He has he's lectured internationally on themes of moral philosophy, economic development, social theory, and entrepreneurship. You can catch him on podcasts and radio interviews. He produced a wonderful series called The Poverty Cure DVD series a number of years ago, of which he was the host and producer. And last but not least, Michael is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Hildebrand Project, and I think one of the original trustees. So it's a joy to be with the two of you. Pete, we'll turn it over to you first.
Okay, thank you, John Henry, very much for that introduction. And Michael and I were talking ahead of time. And so I'm going to just try to paint a picture of the body-soul question with an emphasis on a personalist approach to it. And then Michael's going to bring us into contemporary culture on the question. And hopefully those two together will give us a good basis for discussion in the Q&A. And I'll do my best to keep in the 10 to 15 minute range like everyone else has so successfully done. So Augustine once said, the manner in which spirits are joined to bodies and become living beings is thoroughly marvelous and cannot be comprehended by man, but this is precisely what man is. So we have immaterial dimensions to us, like our thoughts or love or feelings or our consciousness, our soul. By the way, I'm in favor of the tripartite anthropology view. I'll be using the soul as a word to capture spirit and soul in this talk, maybe more so spirit, actually. But it takes human beings a while to grasp. The pre-Socratics didn't really have a concept of immaterial reality, and Augustine himself says in the Confessions somewhere that he thought God was physical, not with arms and legs, but physical, until he realized his own intellect that he was thinking the thought with wasn't physical. And it's a great thing. And so then suddenly Augustine himself was opened up to the idea of immaterial reality. And of course, Wojtyła, which we've been hearing about all week, wants to talk about subjectivity, interiority, the inner life of the person. All of the unrepeatability of the person is included within this spiritual dimension of us. And all of this is immaterial. And so Wojtyła, in Love and Responsibility, at the beginning of it, he distinguishes between meanings of object and subject, the root words of other words that have opposite meanings. Like with subjective, we say subjectivism, which means relativism, but we also say subjectivity, which is the inner life of the person. And Wojtyła wants to focus on this inner life of the person, the subjectivity of the person. And the reason why he does this word analysis at the beginning is because he says, don't think I mean subjectivism when I'm talking about subjectivity, because subjectivity is in some sense the most objective, the most really real aspect of the universe. Love is more real than a physical object. And so he wants to philosophize about the subjectivity of persons, this inner life of them, okay? Now, Augustine and Newman both also, in a funny way, talk about how if there were some angels who never heard of us and someone told them about us, they would be confused. They would say, what do you mean a rock can talk? How can something physical talk? Um, and and so that's a funny way to get across the idea that there is a profound mystery that human persons are a mixture of spirit and matter. Now, Joseph Seifert in his Body Soul books distinguishes very helpfully between the fact that we can say many things about the relations between spirit and matter in human persons, which I'm going to get to at the end of my talk, some of those. But the ultimate how spirit and matter are united in human persons remains utterly mysterious. It's beyond us. This is why contemporary neuroscientists, the ones who are materialists, which is most of them, but strikingly, a lot of them are becoming believers in the soul because of neuroscience. But this is why they are dogmatists, actually. So materialist neuroscientists will say, we have no idea. They keep looking. How does the brain cause consciousness? Is it in the synaptic gap? Is it the ion channels? Is it the tubules? They keep looking. They say, we have no clue how it happens, but then they just assert it happens. The brain is the cause of thought, of love, so forth. So the personalists would say they're looking in the wrong spot and they will never find the answer because your brain does not think. And your brain does not cause your consciousness. And that might have surprised you when I just said your brain doesn't think. Maybe you thought, is he crazy? Did he just say my brain doesn't think? But if you thought that thought, look inside yourself phenomenologically and realize that your conscious personal self is who you experience coming up with the question, did he just say my brain doesn't think? And you have no experience of your brain or synapses or blood constructing your question, but you do have an inner experience of your conscious personal self making your question. And so your self is actually not your brain. And we can talk about that more in the Q&A. And Michael, he's actually more into the whole I've been interested in it too, the neuroscience philosophy debate. And so is Michael. So what we would say, personalists would say, is that the healthy brain is a condition for a human who's a unity of spirit and matter for us to be able to, you could say, perform higher functions. If you get knocked on the head, you lose your consciousness. But it's too much of a jump to go from that fact to say that the brain is also the full explanation of your love for your mother or something like this. Okay. But anyway, so back to this ultimate how. How does my act of the will move my arm? Or how does actually spiritual thoughts before brain processes occur cause brain processes to occur? That happens. This how remains utterly mysterious. Now, the reason why there are 4 basic views on the body-soul question in philosophy, which I will outline, I would suggest is because of the mystery of this how. So the first 2 views are called materialism and spiritualism. So materialism, as it sounds, is the view that says there is nothing spiritual in the world, nothing spiritual. There's only matter. Now, most materialists who think about the body-soul question can't hold that view for very long because love, thoughts, and so forth aren't physical. You can't take them out of your head with a pair of tweezers and wiggle your question in front of me. It's not physical. And so most materialists who think about the question reduce down to a form of materialism called epiphenomenalism, which is the view that all spiritual realities are completely and utterly caused and explained by something physical. That's like what most neuroscientists hold. The opposite of that is spiritualism, which says there's nothing physical in the universe. This one always surprises my students when I bring it up. And they say, you might say, well, what about my knuckles? And a spiritualist would say, an extreme spiritualist would say, your soul is the only thing that exists and it's making you think you have a body, but you don't actually have one. Now, those 2 views might sound shocking, the materialism and the spiritualism, but they're rooted, I suggest, in the fact that these people have experienced, the people who hold these views, the mystery, the inexplicability. And so in order to deal with their inability to rest in a mystery, It's a type of rationalistic pride. They reject one side of the equation, so there's no more mystery, okay? Now, dualism is the third and the fourth view, two forms of dualism. One I'm going to call, with using the terminology of Stephen Schwartz, separation dualism, and the other unity dualism. And separation dualism is the view that, yeah, they both, dualism two means two. We have a spiritual and material side, even a soul and a body we have. Dualists hold that. Separation dualists say that there's no meaningful connection between the soul and the body in a human being. And in fact, most of them degrade the body and exalt the soul. So Socrates couldn't wait to die because he thought his body was holding him back from contemplating reality, and he wanted the soul to be free, which he was convinced was immortal, from the body to see reality more clearly. By the way, reverting back to those epiphenomenalists, they can't believe in an afterlife because the brain is what they say the cause or the substrate or the substance of your soul, your conscious life. And so when it becomes mush, it can't do that causing anymore. It's a little side point. And then, of course, the Manichaeans are the most famous, maybe, example of dualists who degrade the body. And maybe you're familiar with that, and I don't want to spend too much time on it now to come up in the Q&A. But this idea that the body is somehow evil. Okay, now unity dualism, and this is what I want to focus on, is the word I'm using for what the personalists would hold, okay, about the body-soul question. And the first point to make is that there's an intimate, meaningful, rich, important union between body and soul in persons, okay? So in his theology of the body, John Paul II says that he has this phrase, you are your body. You are your body. Now, that's what materialists say. You are your body because there's no soul. Now, what did John Paul mean when he said you are your body? He can't be denying the soul like a materialist. He can't do that. He's the Pope, deny the soul. So why does he say you are your body? I would say that I think it's his way to express in language something that's barely expressible in language, and that is the mystery of the closeness of the union of spirit and matter in human persons, okay? And so now what I'd like to do is do some phenomenology with you. Some of these examples are from Joseph Seifert's book on the body soul and a little bit of Edith Stein in here, but I've sort of put them into my own words. So, and Ludger Herschel's book also. So what I want to do for the rest of my time here is think about 2 or 3 or 4 examples of very common everyday human experiences that we all have, and try to think yourself into them and get an experiential sense of the intimate union of spirit and matter that human persons are. So the first one is sense perception. And Augustine says sense perception is rooted in the body, soul, substance together in both sides. So we're primarily using hearing, not only hearing right now, to transcend ourselves to each other. But if there was a dog in this room with, obviously they have eardrums, which would be vibrating. So all of the physiological side of sense perception, the eardrums, the synapses, and so forth, would be happening in the animal. But something utterly mysterious happens between you and me, because I'm thinking of some meaning, hopefully something meaningful, which isn't physical, that meaningful thought. And then I'm using my mouth to make sound waves, and your physiological process is happening. And then something utterly amazing happens. You have the immaterial meaning that I was thinking in your soul. And that jump between the physiological and the spiritual that happens in sense perception is kind of miraculous if you really think about it. Okay, I have to do these rather quickly because of time. So the second one, the immediate presence of the person in the body. If someone like your father, say, pats you on the back because you did well in sports, you feel his pride, something immaterial. But how does that work? You don't say, oh, that hand must like that shoulder. Or if someone slaps you in the cheek, you don't say that hand must not like that cheek. You immediately experience the pride or the feeling of insult in the body when the pat or the slap happens. And this can only be that way because of this immediate presence of the spiritual in the person. Another way to express this immediate presence is using a distinction. The terms come from the philosopher Damien Federica between instrumental and embodying acts. So an instrumental bodily act would be like slicing bread just to get a job done. An example, an embodying act is a bodily act which carries and is meant to carry a specific spiritual meaning. So an example would be a kiss on the cheek. And the spiritual meaning for a kiss on the cheek, if you wanted to put it in words, would be tender affection. And that's meant to be there, not like in Bulgaria, if you go like this, I hear it means no. And if you go like this, it means yes in Bulgaria. You can switch out the nod or the shake for meanings. But a kiss on the cheek, Judas, he kissed Jesus on the cheek to betray him. And what he did was he vacated the meaning that goes with the kiss on the cheek from it, and thereby instrumentalized or violated a kiss and a friend. Jesus says, friend, you betray me with a kiss. So what I want to say here is there are some spiritual meanings that are meant to be necessarily connected to some physical actions. And those are the embodying acts, okay? And then human expression, I'll just do two more really quickly. Human expression is quite stunning. John Paul II once said of Mother Teresa that he saw the meaning of Mother Teresa in her eyes. And sometimes you can see a person, maybe they're not even talking to you, just to pick a negative example, and you could just feel rudeness. What is that? It's actually utterly amazing that the posture, the tone of voice, the look in the eye of a person, which are all physical expressions, get to be that way because of what persons think and feel and decide. That human expression is the most stunning, maybe, example of the intimate union of body and soul. When you say a happy face, what do you mean? Teeth are happy, skin cells are happy? No, but the face is happy. So somehow happiness, which isn't physical, is immediately present in the face. And this is what makes empathy, by the way, possible. This intimate union, because we feel, you could have a friend who you think is having a very nice day. It could be nothing more than a quiver in their lip. And suddenly you're overwhelmed with the empathetic awareness, they're sad. How does a quiver in the lip do that? It's because of the intimate union of the spiritual and the physical that we are. And then my last one is the uniqueness of persons, which Dr. Crosby was talking about on the first day. Sometimes I'll ask my students, why do you put into words why you love someone? Because remember, the uniqueness of persons is ineffable. So it's a trick question. A lot of times they'll say, well, I think it's because of how they walk or how they laugh. But it's not, strictly speaking, laughter or walk that you love, but somehow the unrepeatable, precious person who you love is impressed on the laugh or the walk in such a way that through those you are given the person, the unique person, which is very profound and very beautiful. Okay, so all right, I think I went about the right amount of time, so I'm just going to stop and go to Michael, and then we can. Okay. John Henry, you're muted, I think.
That was wonderful, Pete, and lots of food for conversation. So Michael, we'll hear from you, and then we'll go to our discussion. And I invite people to start submitting your questions through Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, John Henry. Thank you, Pete. That was excellent. I think really a good articulation of why the body matters. So what I want to do very briefly is I want to give more of like a thematic view. I was teasing Professor Colosi. He was going to do the heavy lifting and I was just going to talk about it. And turns out my teasing is totally true. So I'm going to do a little bit of a thematic view here on why the body matters, why embodiment is so important, and what does it mean to be an embodied, embedded person. So I think ultimately we have today the problem, what Alistair McIntyre calls, we've forgotten the body. Whether it's transgenderism, transhumanism, artificial intelligence, neuroscience that Pete talked about, a new ontology of the person based on sexual predilection. the way we think about abortion or marriage or other things, we've forgotten the body. There's confusion over what it means to be a human person. And as Rabbi Gottlieb said yesterday, and I agree with this, we are in an anthropological struggle. That's the situation of our time. We're in an anthropological struggle. What does it mean to be a human person? And here, the personalists, Wojtyła, von Hildebrand, Shaler, other thinkers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Cardinal Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, Augusto Del Noce, I think they were early on recognizing that was the struggle of the 20th and the 21st century. It was a struggle over what does it mean to be a human person. So if you think about like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 50s, there was a tendency in the United States and the West of the struggle between communism and then the kind of democratic capitalist West. And many of us thought this was a political struggle or an economic struggle. But people like Solzhenitsyn said, no, it's fundamentally an anthropological struggle. And part of that, I think, was understandable. It was partially political and economic, but I think we made an error. And the error we made was to reduce Marxism to its economic and political manifestations, instead of seeing it as Marx and the socialists saw it themselves as a anthropological vision, a vision of man and society. And so Augusto Del Noce, the wonderful Italian Catholic philosopher, argued in 1989, right before he died, he said, Marxism failed in the East because it succeeded in the West. And so this idea that this anthropological move, now it's bigger than Marxism, but it's the point of the personalists, they're recognizing that the fundamental questions of our time are not so much economic, but what does it mean to be a person? So there's this deep confusion of what it means to be a person, whether it's the will. Our will is seen either as something for like a radical exercise of our will, which Ratzinger says at the end becomes a diabolical freedom, because an irrational will is not a free will. The example I give sometimes, if I started like, there's a lamp, if I started banging my head on this lamp, you wouldn't look at me and think, wow, Michael is so incredibly free. Rather, you would look at me that I was crazy, that I was irrational. So the one side of the will is that it's just radical freedom, or the other side is that we don't have free will, we're determined. And here, and Professor Colosi brought this up, there's a lot of this in neuroscience and neurobiology. I mean, it's popularized by Sam Harris, but this idea that we don't have freedom. And of course, the question is, I mean, if there's no freedom, I'm not totally sure why people are making long, drawn out arguments to get me to change my mind that we don't have a will. But that's another question. It's kind of like E.O. Wilson. This really made me, Pete talked about this. E.O. Wilson said, that he's just kind of a materialist view. And he said, ethics are just something fobbed off on us like by our evolutionary. It's like an error. And so the question is, well, how did you figure that out? How did you get outside of the system to figure that out? So there's a lot of deep incoherence there, but nevertheless, it's very popular and a lot of people buy into this. So the determinism side. The other problem, of course, is reason. Now, we heard already during the week that reason is one of the distinguishing characteristics of the human person, that we can engage in rational discourse. But we've reduced reason to the empirical. We've limited reason to merely analytical, kind of empirical reasoning. And this is a problem, not only because it's incoherent on its own terms, right? Because you can't empirically demonstrate that reason is only empirical, but it also leaves out the most important human experiences: justice, right, wrong, mercy, love, compassion, friendship. And so these get relegated outside the realm of reason, and they're kind of dehumanized. They become kind of sentimental. And here we see in the personalists, we see in Wojtyła, the idea of spiritual emotions. Like he's kind of rehabilitating rationality. Of course, Ratzinger's papacy has a lot to do with that, but Wojtyła rehabilitating spiritual emotions. C.S. Lewis, in his magnificent book, The Abolition of Man, talks about reasonable emotions. And Dietrich von Hildebrand calls it intelligible spiritual affectivity, which I'm almost certain is one word in German. But in some ways, it's the clearest. There's an intelligible, and this goes exactly to what Pete was talking about, intelligible spiritual affectivity. It goes through the intellect in conjunction with the will, and it's an embodied experience. I'll talk about embodiment in a minute. But without that, we have what Lewis calls the abolition of man. So there's the confusion, the will, the reason. There's also deep confusion about our social nature. We're either seen to be radical individuals or kind of parts of a collective. And this has come up through a number of the talks. But as Rocco Buttiglione pointed out, the personalist idea is not somewhere like in the middle between these two things, but rather it's a different way of thinking about the person as embodied. There's also confusion about work, whether either work's a punishment to be avoided and we need luxury automated communism to free ourselves from the burdens of work, or the machines will do it, or work is all that we live for, what makes us. So all these deep confusions, and I think at the core of them, and I don't want to overstate it, and so feel free to disagree if you think it's wrong, but I think the deepest confusion is actually about the body. What does it mean to be embodied? And that confusion about the body kind of permeates all these other things. They're all, I guess, working together. But so we're in this view of either dualism or materialism that Pete pointed out. And Professor James Madden, I think I like how he articulates this. Both of these are basically mechanistic views of the person that instrumentalize the body. So with that first part, we're at this position where I would say we've landed in a place where we are disembodied, disembedded persons. And the personalist move is to say, no, we're actually embodied and embedded persons. So embodied, Pete spent a lot of time talking about that. Let me just briefly say what I mean by embedded. And I think it's deeply connected to embodiment. So each of what we're like Norris Clark talks about a substance in relationship. And this has been a theme throughout a lot of the several parts during the course of this week, that we're in relationship, but we're a subject. We're not an object to be manipulated, but we're in relationship with others. And I think the way of things is we're embedded. We're born into a family. We're born into a culture, into language, into a certain region. I mean, we're embedded right from the beginning in our mother. Okay. All of our individual subjectivity, which is in the uniqueness, all of which I'm affirming, it's also embedded. And that embeddedness is actually is different from the sense of just being part of a collective, right? And so, I think it's Heidegger, and I can correct me if I'm wrong, at one point was kind of thinking, I can escape and be completely by myself if I just contemplate a triangle. Maybe, but once you say triangle, you're now part of this long history of language, of ideas, of development that you are inside. And so the importance of, I think, embodiment embedded is, one, because it meets with our lived experience. Two, it helps us understand our social nature in a more profound way. And three, very practically, if you live your life as a disembodied, disembedded person, you are unhappy, right? And yet, this is the kind of themes of the day. So if we look then, and I'll go over a couple of examples, if we look at how this disembodied, disembedded person impacts the way we think today, let's just take a couple of examples that I think all of you know very well. One, let's look at, say, for example, of artificial intelligence and computers. So we've modeled the human person on a machine, and now we're modeling the human person on a computer, right? So if you look at this idea of artificial intelligence, there's two things kind of going up. One is, well, we're just matter. This goes back to Pete's point about materialism. We're just matter, and we got consciousness. So our machines are going to develop into consciousness too, because it's evolutionary matter, right? Again, notice the problem with the body, right? Or this idea that, we can build a mind with a computer. But the reason they think we can build a mind based on a computer is because they've modeled the mind on a computer, which is an error. It's a circular error, because the computer is not a mind, right? And I'll go at the end, I'm going to do a little phenomenology too, to talk about how to think about our embodied experiences. So there's just an error right at the beginning of this artificial intelligence, and also with neuroscience. That a wonderful book called The Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience, Bennett and Hacker, point out what we're experiencing in the way we think about neuroscience and artificial intelligence, but especially neuroscience, is what they call a mutant or degenerate Cartesianism. So instead of having the mind and the body, we now just have the brain and the rest of us, right? And this goes back to Pete's question, like a hacker asks, who is this self that has a brain? Who is this self that's experiencing the world? Is the brain thing? Who is this self? And so you see deep error in the kind of artificial intelligence and neuroscience. A second major error, especially related to the question of gender, is what I'm calling a new ontology of the person. So we've been talking about what kind of thing are we? What kind of being are we? What's our essential structure? And then how we have this unique unrepeatability around it. Well, I think what's happening is there's a flip taking place. So you had in the 20th century, the rise of, say, radical existentialism, kind of an existential total liberty. You can do whatever you want. But notice that in the area of LGBTQ, that radical freedom doesn't give anybody any grounds for rights, because, okay, you do your thing, I'll do mine. So what we're seeing is what I would call an inverted Thomism. Or something to that effect, where instead of you have an essence and then you have existence. So instead of having an ontology in Wojtyła's language, you have self-possession, you're given to yourself as a gift, and then you have self-determination. But that self-determination is within a structure of a kind of thing you are. There's no kind of thing you are. You just have total freedom. And then you choose yourself. And so what happens is the new ontology of the person is reducing or identifying the person based on their sexual predilection. So you choose LGBTQ, whatever it might be, and then the plastic hardens. And then who you are is determined by that sexual predilection. And now it's important. Why is that important politically? Because who you are is more important than what you hold. And so even you could say with dignitatis humanae, you can't use religion to like discriminate against who someone is. And so the new ontology of the person, what you're seeing is dignity is being used as a weapon against religious liberty. And this is very serious. It's actually written into the Yogarda Principles of the UN. It's written into German law, South African law, and increasingly in US law through a number of things, but I won't go into that. So this idea, so that's the problem of this new ontology of the person. A third problem is the problem of transhumanism. And there's kind of two ways of thinking about that as well. One is we're going to technologically restructure the person, right? Augment the person because we're just matter and we can fix it. Or we're going to create some system where we can upload ourselves to the internet. Okay, so Yuval Harari says death is a glitch. It's just a technical glitch and we can fix that. Okay, but again, here we have this deep misunderstanding of the body. All right. So the personalism of the 20th century, and as we've talked about, comes out of a tradition with Greeks and the Jewish tradition, the medievals, I think is a reaffirmation of the body. And it's not just a reaffirmation of the body, it's a reaffirmation of matter and a reaffirmation of being, that being is good and it's intelligible. Augustine has that beautiful line that all things are good insofar as they have being. Now, the Protestant, the secular, and the Manichaean, and the transhumanist, the body is something we have to escape from, as Pete talked about, right? It's something that holds us back. So the transhumanist is going to augment it so we can get to a new level of human being, right? We're going to create a mind, like Ray Kurzweil says, right? And this body is holding us back. We have to escape. But if you look at the Orthodox Jewish and Catholic and the Orthodox tradition, you see that the body is good because matter is good, because being is good. And so I think a key element of the personalist tradition is the affirmation of the body. And so Wojtyła, for example, and von Hildebrand, both living under Nazism, and then Wojtyła with communism, and we see it also with secularism, that the body is seen as instrumental, right? So bodies can be experimented on for medical, they can be used for the glory of the state to build great things. They can be exploited by the capitalist for growth in GDP, right? They can be used to extract gratification by using the conjugal act simply for pleasure. But Wojtyła says no to all of these. He says no, whether it's economics, the conjugal life, politics. The person is not simply an object to be manipulated. The body is not simply an instrumental thing to be used, right? But the person is a subject. And as Pete says, you are your body. You are an embodied person. And it's interesting that Wojtyła goes right back to Genesis, to the original unity of man and woman, but also to the affirmation of being. And this, as Ratzinger points out in some of his homilies, is kind of unique, right? It's the beginning of secularism, he says, because, oh, the world's not divine. Actually, there's a creator, and it's created by the world, but it's not made of dragon's blood. There's no demiurge. No, the world is good, and matter is good, and being is good, and marriage is good. And so if you notice that a lot of it is, we kind of, and I'll say this very quickly, you kind of get a sense that, like, well, Catholics are just kind of down on this, the personalists are down on this, but actually it's a deep reaffirmation of the goodness of being and the goodness of matter. And I think that's the attraction to that. You can also see this, interestingly, not just in his Theology of Body catechesis, but in his devotion to Mary. Because Mary, in one sense, teaches us love of the flesh, properly understood. The Puritan and the pornographer, as Pieper points out, are two sides of the same coin. They despise the flesh, but a true love of the flesh, right, respects and affirms the body. And this leads me to the last point I want to make on the personalist movement, which is Wojtyła has a beautiful articulation of tenderness in Love and Responsibility, I think in other places, where tenderness is really the great resistance to totalitarianism. It's the great resistance to, say, the instrumentalization of the person. It's a great resistance to the capitalist, say, big tech idea that every experience you have, every conversation you have, every emotion that you feel is data to be collected and instrumentalized and used against you. And Wojtyła says, no, there's this realm of the private where tenderness takes place, where tenderness can grow. And I think the other thing that's so beautiful there is it's connected again to the tradition of what's called con-natural knowing, right? So Carl Stern, in his beautiful book, Flight from Woman, has a magnificent chapter on this, where he's relying on a lot of the personalists and Shaler, this idea that we have inarticulate rationality. And this goes back to Pete's, I think, experiences. So you have this idea of tenderness and the reaffirmation of the body. So the dominant view of today is that we've forgotten the body, in McIntyre's words. And I recommend Carter Schneed's excellent book, What It Needs to Be Human. We focused on the will, and that human flourishing is just an exercise of our will. And I think so the personalists go to this reaffirmation, and as Buttiglione said, Hegel's only half right. Yes, there's master-slave relationship. Yes, it's part of our nature to subject and to rape and to kill, but it's also part of our nature to ask what's good, ask what's right, and to engage in loving self-donation. And so I think I've used my time. I was going to do a small phenomenology about uploading, but I cannot. So thank you very much. And I look forward to questions, and thank you, Pete and John Henry.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Pete. Two wonderful and very thought-provoking conversations, and there's some very interesting questions here. And feel free to look at them. I'll pose a few. Let me just begin with one for both of you, because it just occurs to me that it's the question I have on, particularly in response to you, Michael, but really in response to the whole account of the body, which is whether or not it seems to me that it's very difficult, that outside of the context or the tradition of faith and the kind of metaphysical tradition that we've inherited, to fault, let's just say, the transhumanists for their views about the body, because of course the original givenness of the world, the givenness of nature's essences and so on, none of that is there as a starting premise. And then one could consider, whether there are these are sort of natural attempts at immortality and so on, which of course is deep in us. So I wonder to what extent, is transhumanism and all of these different expressions of the flight from the body, are those things that just have to burn themselves out through very bad experiences as people sort of come up against limits? Or are there ways of, in other words, is there really a compelling way at finding out the untruth in this approach, intellectually, spiritually, without, in some sense, just having to find out very directly? And of course, that can be very damaging societally, culturally. It's not recommending we take that approach, but I just wonder in a time not only without faith, but with where we don't, the other word that comes to mind is creaturehood. I mean, there's no sense of being a creature. Or finitude is another term that comes to mind. Finitude seems more like, a challenge to be solved for a transhumanist than a kind of fundamental reality that we have to accept and live within. And of course, as a Christian or a person of faith, that all comes together because there's a loving creator God that has placed us in this finite setting. So I just wonder what either of you would say on sort of that line of questioning about sort of these issues as they arise in a world that is profoundly secularist, and where many of the people pushing these, whether it's the transgenderism or the transhumanism, are people who don't operate with all of these kind of core metaphysical and Christian principles.
So I'll start really quickly, or you want to start, Pete?
Well, I only have one short comment about the classroom. And this is Michael's bailiwick, so I'll make my short comment and then he can do the heavy lifting. Just what I would say is I taught a course last semester, a new one, I invented it. It's called Philosophy and Neuroscience. And my goal was to bring up these questions. And I think most college students today are more so because of the culture we live in, maybe thinking naturally in terms of what Michael expressed. But if you just bring up the dogmatism of neuroscientists and show them examples, and then some of these phenomenological ways of experiencing your own spiritual self, and bring out the contrast, most of them are deeply moved and attracted to unity dualism. And you don't have to talk about God. So that's all I wanted to say. So Michael, go ahead.
Well, so just quickly, I agree with Pete on that experience. Like one of the things when I'm teaching, I talk about when I talk about Christian anthropology, I often, and this is very much of a personalist thing, say, go back to your lived experience. And that's what Pete does, right? So that, and I think you can show a little bit through lived experience, like, wait, that doesn't do justice to the complexity of the emotional life that I have and want. And so I think there's an attraction there. So a couple of quick things really to your question, John Henry. One, I think you're right, it's not new. And there's a comment here in the things that, you see this in Rousseau. Absolutely. I mean, Robert Nisbet called Rousseau the demon of the modern mind for a reason. Rousseau, Hobbes, and Locke are giving an alternative to the Genesis narrative. It's radical individuals. It's deeply problematic. Okay. So, but you all see it in the Tower of Babel. There's this desire, let us burn bricks and make a name for ourselves. Rabbi Mitch Rockland has a line that I like a lot. He says, if there's no covenant, then it's all left to man. And so that's kind of a tension there with that creator thing. If there's no covenant, then you feel that you have to solve the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death through technical means. That's the new Tower of Babel. And Ratzinger writes about this eloquently in Jesus of Nazareth, Volume 1. But I would say, so here's so that's the first. I think the other thing is, you can show the incoherence of it, as Pete said. But I think there's two other things. The desire to create heaven on earth, to upload ourselves to this desire is, in a sense, part of it's a manifestation of our desire for the transcendent and for God. And so in one sense, it can be nihilistic, but in another sense, it's not nihilistic. There's an openness to something. And there's like a pretty well-known transhumanist guy who said to the religious people, like, look, you guys and I are the same. We both want eternal life. You think you get it this way, through the resurrection of the body. We're going to create a longevity, but there's that desire there. And I think pointing to that is very important. And then I think the reality is this. I mean, one of the things that helps you get out of that, besides suffering, is marriage and babies. Right. And tenderness. This is why Wojtyła, I think maybe we've overlooked the importance of tenderness. I actually think there's a parallel. I'm going to write a paper on this between Orwell's relationship of Julia and Winston. It's not dangerous to the state when it's just radical sexual, liberation. It gets more dangerous the more tenderness it becomes. And I think this experience of life, I think people are lonely, and this confusion about embodiment, and about the real self inside you, all these things are so deep-seated. One of the ways out, and I'm not saying you get there easily, is by having actual experience of tenderness, marriage, and babies. And this is why I think Wojtyła's work is just so absolutely important, not just on the theoretical, but on a practical means.
Pete, let me pick up this question with you again. There's a question here from Maria Federica that reminds me of a paper of yours that I've read about the language of the soul and how difficult it is that you found that this is a term that students in the classroom don't resonate with, and you have to go through this using these autobiographical experiences. And I just want to push back on this. On the one hand, you're saying, people don't have to be persuaded of some sides of this because experience will sort of solve it. But it seems, on the other hand, that the materialistic, mechanistic language has informed people's imagination. So maybe you could just say a little bit on what you've come across in trying to sort of rehabilitate that language with your students.
Yeah, and I didn't mean it's immediately solved on the first day of class. It usually takes a long time with talking and so forth. But what John Henry's referring to there is, and I can send you all this article. I put my email in the chat. I published it in the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly. And in that article, I explained how I discuss the spiritual soul in the classroom in this setting. And I've learned over the years to begin with, rather than philosophy texts, autobiographical texts. So some of them you probably have read. One is called Ghost Boy by Martin Pistorius, who was a young man in locked-in syndrome for 10 years, and nobody thought he could hear what everyone was saying, and he could. His soul was perfectly functioning. His inner life, his interior was perfectly functioning, but his body was so damaged that people didn't know it. And eventually he got the ability to communicate and wrote a book. He told everybody everything he heard in this book. So that scares students. They didn't know locked-in syndrome was a possibility. And what it does is it puts their focus immediately on the soul. In fact, they become separation dualists for a while, which I'm kind of happy about, because they're so interested in not wounding his feelings that happened, because he was abused during some of the time and so forth. And so it really wakes them up to the reality of, let's just say, interiority as something that's beyond physical. And then I also use When Breath Becomes Air by Kalanithi. Is it Paul Kalanithi? He's a neuroscientist, neurosurgeon who died of cancer. And in the last year of his at age 36, he wrote a book trying to explore whether literature or neuroscience holds the deepest meaning to life. And that really brings out the same thing for the students. And then I also use Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning in certain ways in that regard. So as we've been hearing from David Brooks and others, story, and from Marguerite yesterday, these autobiographical stories that really bring out in a profound way the body-soul question are a better way to begin, I think, before you start reading philosophy texts on this question. It wakes them up to the question.
Let me, if I may, just pose a couple of questions here. If we can sort of keep the answers short, we might be able to cover a number of them, because there's some very good questions here. So maybe Pete, you can take this one, and then Michael, I've got a couple here for you as well. There are a few people who are asking here about the hylomorphism and whether the personalist account of the body-soul union, how does that track essentially with the traditional Aristotelian Thomistic view of hylomorphism. And then I think one question asks whether there's any sort of resistance or hesitation to the hylomorphic account in the personalist account of the body-soul relation.
Well, one book I recommend is by Ludger Herschel called The Reality of the Mind. And he's coming from the phenomenological perspective, but he very beautifully shows in there that there's less of a disagreement that you might think. Thomas, around question 79 or 75 somewhere, he actually says that the body and the soul are two substances. But to maybe just nail the point, one difference between the phenomenologists and maybe just the strict hylomorphic view is that the phenomenologists are keen on expressing the idea, like Cardinal Newman does too, that the soul completely transcends the body. So the personalists don't deny that the soul is the form of the body, the soul is the life principle of the body. But there's a whole realm of spiritual transcendence that is beyond or isn't accounted for by saying the soul forms the body. And so that needs to be developed. And then I don't know if the person meant about, I said unity dualism. I think Aquinas is a unity dualist. I don't like the rejection of the term dualism by uniting it exclusively with separation dualism, like Manichaeism. We have to say there are two principles, a spiritual and a physical, okay? And Thomas does hold that the spiritual soul is somehow still present, separate from the body, until we're waiting for the resurrection. So,
Pete, what if I were to frame it slightly differently? This wasn't quite the question, but personalists will sometimes speak. I think they recognize that there's the body-soul problem, particularly as it's been articulated, but they often want to speak in terms of the person-body distinction. And that has advantages and disadvantages. I mean, in part, it's because they want to preserve the idea of the spiritual person as just irreducible. Right. But on the other hand, that raises questions about a different kind of dualism, you know?
Thank you. Whenever I teach this, I always have to, like I did at the beginning of this one briefly, is define terms. And I like to say, sometimes I'll be using the word person to refer to the spiritual soul exclusively, but really I mean by person, the embodied person. So I think as long as you express, which personalists don't mean to separate the body from person in a separation dualist way. Body, like that's what's so beautiful about theology of the body, of John Paul II. The body is brought into the dignity of the person, and it's even part of the image of God that we are. And so you just have to be careful to say how you're using the word person. Sometimes, yes, personalists use it just to refer to the spiritual soul, but we don't mean by that to be separation dualists. We're just trying to get a word to express this amazing ability of self-transcendence. But body in personalists is part of person in this deeply intimate way that I tried to express.
Thank you,
Michael. Can I jump in quickly on that, John Henry?
Yeah.
Just really fast. I mean, I like hylomorphism more and more as I think it through. I mean, that I actually am not comfortable with talking about the person and body. I think that's an error. I think it's an error that leads to a lot of problems. I know there's not enough time to go into it, but I'm going to do a little self-promotion here. I have an interview with James Madden. James Madden wrote an interesting book on hylomorphism, and we talk about dualism. It's about a 2-hour interview that'll come out next week on my podcast, The Moral Imagination. It's all about hylomorphism and this embodiment and what it means. And I think, but I'd recommend his book as well. And I'm actually I have this thought experiment that if St. Thomas came back, he might look at all the Thomists and the personalists and say, like, what happened to you guys? How'd you become such dualists? And he'll, look back kind of like Gandalf going to figure out the past. And it was this Descartes fellow that has a mutant in our way. So I think hylomorphism is an important thing because it's a theory of nature too, not just a theory of the person. And I think that's why John Paul's personalism, which is connected to Thomism, is so powerful. But I know I've just started a lot of fights.
Yes, indeed. Well, we're really up against the limit of our time. There's an excellent question here that's just come in that would be a whole new. I think this is from Mark Spencer. Perhaps I can't quite see here. Let's just take up the one question from Peter Meilander about the relationship between. So the question, which you maybe did you all see the question about embodiment and embeddedness? I'll just read it here. Simply that the important features of embodiment and embeddedness are the particular local communities that we're in. And I'm being told to wrap things up here. In any case, the question is just what you all think about globalization. Does globalization, in what sense is that at the root of the erosion of local communities? In what sense is it a contributing factor?
Well, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow a little bit. And
that's true. That's true.
It's a mix. It's a mix. I mean, if you like coffee, you like globalization. If you don't hate globalization, stop drinking coffee. But that globalization also has negatives, and I think localism is a really important issue. But I'll talk about it tomorrow. Can I take 30 seconds to say one more thing?
Yes.
About embodiment. Okay. So this is an example I want to give. I think it's related to its phenomenology. So about embodiment and the problem with transhumanism. So imagine you're outside, and it's really fast. and it's a beautiful day, and you have peach in your hand, and the peach is dripping down your hand, and you're watching your daughter, and your daughter is twirling, and the sun is shining. You smell from the pine grove, and you imagine, you think a little bit of sadness that you're not enough there for her, and you need to be more attentive, and you think with gratitude that God brought you to this time, and that you actually have this family. But you're also sad because you're going to perhaps die. But you look forward to the future of the resurrection of the body, and you're in this situation, and the breeze is blowing, and all these memories and all this embeddedness. And here's the question: how are you going to upload that? It's embodied experience. And I think this goes to the early question that you asked, John Henry, that and I think that's why Pete's work in the story is so important. I just wanted to affirm that when we actually do a phenomenology of what's actually taking place, like right now, I'm relying upon rebar and width and petroleum and all these things. When we start to kind of stop ignoring the invisible, push down to ask deep questions, I think it's really a wonderful, the whole transhumanist thing falls apart. It's a house of cards, because it's not taking seriously the actual, not just lived experience, but the reality of our embedded embodied selves. And I think that's the beauty and the attraction of personalism. That yes, you have to lose certain of your political things, but you deal with this deep self. If that makes sense, a deep experience of an embodied self. So,
well, many thanks to both of you. We could clearly keep going here. The questions show that. Thank you, Pete, for your remarks. Thank you, Michael. Everyone, stay with us. We'll be starting our next session here in just a few minutes.